Sustainability data can often be a mess, siloed, fragmented, even a bit unhygienic.
But our guest today says perfect data is the enemy of action.
We are diving into why you don't need a perfect spreadsheet to start reducing risk and how a letter from Patagonia and Walmart changed the apparel industry forever.
Plus, the mindset shift that turns sustainability from a cost center into a CFO's best friend.
Welcome to the pre-read. Just like the slides you get before a big meeting, the pre-read prepares you, CFOs, and other executives for the next big thing. It's the global podcast where finance, sustainability, audit, and risk teams come together in the C-suite.
If you're making decisions at scale or need to understand the leaders who are, you're in the right place. This is the pre-read, brought to you by Workiva.
I'm Steve Soder, accounting enthusiast and Diet Coke aficionado.
And I'm Melissa Zucker, sustainability nerd and equal opportunist caffeine addict.
For many CFOs and executives, the data journey feels like a mountain with no summit, especially when it comes to sustainability. We're told we need granular, verified, and integrated data before we can make a move. But as we're about to learn, waiting for the perfect data actually puts your business at risk.
Today, we're joined by Amina Razvi, a veteran in the sustainability space with over 20 years of experience. As the former CEO of Cascale, formerly the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Amina has been at the forefront of transforming one of the world's most complex supply chains.
Well, Alyssa, as our resident sustainability nerd, what were some of the highlights from our conversation with Amina for you?
There are so many, but I'm going to call out two. So the first is that perfect is the enemy of progress. Companies often stall because they're debating methodologies or they're chasing perfect data, and instead, leaders should focus on decision-grade data, obtaining the right data at the right time for the specific purpose of making a business choice. The second is that sustainability is really risk management. CFOs should view sustainability not as a separate cost center, but as an integrated part of business intelligence. Understanding value chain risks like climate exposure or supply chain concentration is just as vital as understanding a company's financials. How about you, Steve?
Well, first, it's the advantage of collaborating. In complex industries, shared risk requires shared action. And by collaborating with competitors, companies can reduce the cost of audits, they can eliminate duplicated efforts, and they can create enough leverage to actually change market signals. And second is just changing the overall paradigm. Rather than viewing sustainability requirements as regulatory hurdles, for example, leaders who use those constraints to drive creativity can actually improve costs, they can reduce operational risk, and they can open doors for new innovation.
Couldn't agree more. So now let's get to our conversation with Amina Razvi.
Amina, welcome to the show. We are so glad to have you. You have such an interesting background, and the organizations that you've been a part of, I think, are going to become really germane to this conversation. Can you tell our audience a little bit about the work that you've done, the organizations you've been a part of, and maybe how that has sort of translated into your career?
I spent 8 years at the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, 3 as their VP of membership and 5 as the CEO. I left there at the end of 2023, but had been involved in the organization since the very beginning because I came from Gap Inc. And Gap Inc. was actually a founding member of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So I've essentially been around it since its inception.
And what was the guiding mission of the organization when it was formed? What was it driving to achieve and do for the industry?
It was really trying to create social and environmental standards, so tools that the industry could leverage to not only understand their social and environmental impact, but to be able to leverage those tools to drive action both individually and collectively for companies. And so over the course of a decade, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, now Cascale, developed a suite of tools called the Higg Index. And the Higg Index essentially measures social and environmental performance end to end for a company. So it measures everything from, business management at a brand to a facility's social and environmental impact to the products and the materials that an apparel or footwear company might leverage. And so it was really a suite of tools that was meant to be holistic, to to give a company a really solid understanding of their social and environmental impact across every single part of their business and their supply chain.
Amina, sustainability data can within itself be quite fragmented. And then beyond that, siloed from financial data. And, beyond that, just really messy, frankly, and unhygienic and difficult to use. So, from your vantage point, what quality of data is required for companies to really be able to use it to reduce risk and build real resilience?
Yeah, it's a great question and something I've spent a lot of time working on over, the past 20 years in sustainability. And, what I often tell people is that perfect data is the enemy of action. And, what I mean by that is that companies can spend years, debating a methodology or a calculation. They can spend all of this time, trying to get perfect data, and it stops them from essentially acting on that data. And, I think it's really important to say, how do you get the right data at the right time for the right purpose? And what I mean by that is that, there is data that companies are trying to leverage to understand internal business processes. They're trying to understand, what data do you collect so that you have a holistic view of your supply chain and your processes. There's data that you are required to use for disclosure, and all of those different types of data require, different levels of quality, different processes that go with it. And so companies really should be thinking about asking the right questions up front before they just start going after, getting data or building, huge processes or very complex, systems, because companies already have millions and millions of data points at their fingertips. I found, I was working with this company and we were talking about scope 3 and supply chain data. And what we realized was that there was actually a lot of data that already existed. Right. It just happened to be siloed in different parts of the business. So it wasn't like they didn't have it. It wasn't like they didn't know it. And it wasn't like they weren't tracking it on a regular and consistent basis. What was true was that it was, there wasn't kind of a holistic view of that data. There weren't teams that were actually chatting with each other and talking to each other about what one team needed the data for versus another. And then there wasn't kind of a consistency or a process by which these teams could actually report on it on a regular basis and talk to each other about what this data was telling them. And so I think that companies really need to think about those things: is what data is material to them, how do you make sure that data is consistent, and how do you ensure that it's what I call decision grade data, right? Like, what decisions are you trying to make from that data and those insights? And then how are you continually improving that data over time? The other thing that I think is really important is that sustainability data, if people view data as just like, oh, well, this is the sustainability team's purview, and it's not actually integrated with business metrics, financial data, is that it can be messy for a really long time because it's not actually seen in the same way. And so I've found that data quality actually often improves when there is a monetary implication or there's a risk implication, because businesses are then viewing that data, across the business in a much more holistic and integrated way. And therefore teams are incentivized to continue to improve that data. But I think striving for perfect data is kind of a myth. It's never going to happen. But I do think that making sure companies are asking the right questions up front, reviewing the data that they have, starting to integrate those processes and data across the system, and then really making sure that it's integrated with other business metrics is really important. And that's how companies then ultimately end up reducing risk and creating greater resilience, not just for their business, but across their value chain.
That I love the example that you gave around scope 3 greenhouse gas accounting, because it sounds so simple, but when you think about scope 3 accounting, because you have all these different ways in which you can arrive at the number, different calculation methodologies, if you're trying to get a number to report, right, to disclose, you can use spend-based accounting. You can use, industry average. But if you're trying to engage with your suppliers to make different decisions about the materials they're using and the processes involved in your products and goods, then an industry average that doesn't represent that specific supplier isn't going to cut it. And so really making
Yeah.
sure that you're linking the question that you're asking with the data you're using it to find the answer. I love that term. I think I might have to borrow that or amplify that, but it's
Yeah.
it's decision useful, decision grade, because that's what you need here.
Yeah, and I think, I've seen companies who are using industry average data to inform internal directional guidance. And what I mean by that is like, okay, great, like is this good enough for us to think about procurement in a different way, or is it good enough for us to actually make different material choices or product choices, right? And so that's what I mean by like, what are you using the data for? What questions are you trying to answer? Is it internal? Is it external? If it's external and you're reporting and you're disclosing it, then yeah, you need a level of data quality and verification that is different than if you were using it internally to have internal conversations about choices, or make different decisions across your value chain or even internally within your business. And so I think making sure that you've got teams that are connected, or are having those discussions and asking the right questions up front is really important before you go on this huge, big, data journey.
What I kind of read between the lines and hear the theme emerging is this notion of investing in the process of identifying and collecting and enhancing the right data. So if you were talking to an executive, like what's the mindset shift that helps CFOs, to use a specific example, see this data as an asset in which you should invest, as you typically think about an asset, versus a cost center, which is really just something to be kind of like maintained, and hopefully I'm describing the difference there correctly. Tell us about that shift. How would you have that conversation with an executive?
Well, it's interesting because I want to go back a little bit, because I had that exact conversation with the CFO at a Fortune 500 company about 15 years ago. We were talking about investing in, supply chain data, supply chain resilience, looking at it from both a business and a risk standpoint. And, the fascinating thing was the CFO said, well, I get on these investor calls and no one's asking about this. And therefore, is it material? Is it important for the business? How much should we invest in it? And these are, I think, the right questions for CFOs to ask. But 15 years later, I think about that and wonder if that CFO of that company had actually made a different decision 15 years ago to invest a little bit more upfront for that type of supply chain data, to understand their risk. Would that company have been in a better position now? Would they have been able to weather the pandemic or even currently tariffs differently, right? Because they had invested up front. Now, again, that's a little bit of like Monday morning quarterbacking, and there's so many other decisions that are at play. But like that wasn't the only conversation I had, 15 years ago or a decade ago with CFOs who are like, okay, well, why should we invest in this? And what I think is really important is this mindset shift for CFOs, is that CFOs are trying to manage risk for a business, and sustainability, value chain data, supply chain data is about risk, right? It is about, where are you sourcing? Where is your concentration? What does climate exposure do to your supply chain? And so if it is about risk and resilience, I think that CFOs should see this data, as I mentioned, as really integrated to business data and to business metrics, right? And the CFOs that 10, 15 years ago actually did do that are actually, their companies have done better. They are in a better position because they do understand their supply chain better, and they continue to make inroads in getting more visibility, and I think a greater depth of data from across their value chain so that they understand their business better, right? No CFO doesn't understand the financials of their company. And I often say that you need to understand your supply chain and your value chain the same way that you do your business, because it's all related and it's all connected. So if you don't understand, if you understand your business but not your value chain and your supply chain risk, then you're putting your business at risk. The other thing I will say is that I think, to your point, CFOs often see this as a cost center versus an opportunity for cost savings and an opportunity for innovation, right? So, for instance, if you are looking at your owned and operated facilities and you're leveraging sustainability data, electricity, energy, water, waste, et cetera. These are all opportunities for companies to actually reduce their own costs as a business. So if you're reducing your cost year over year, it means that you've got more money to invest in other parts of the business. It also brings up an opportunity for innovation, right? People often say that, these are just constraints. Well, I think that constraints can also lead to creativity, right? So where can you cut cost in one part of the business to then invest it in something else? How can it lead to creativity and innovation in terms of, products or material choices or all sorts of things? And so when I talk to CFOs, I really try to essentially get them to see this as integrated data that helps to support their understanding of their entire business end to end. It helps them to understand their risk. It helps them to drive innovation and creativity. And it ultimately will help them to create a more resilient business for the long term.
Well, and who wouldn't want that? To your point, particularly with tariffs, COVID, supply chain, right? I mean, who wouldn't have wanted all that? Let's maybe shift gears just a little bit. We learned about some really interesting interactions that you had actually had in sharing data with competitors. You work in a space where the competitors choose to collaborate, so that's probably a little bit of a different mindset from basically everybody else, I would imagine. So, like, what's the collaborative advantage as composed to the competitive disadvantages of, bringing industry competitors to the table? And, what role do, what role do executives and others need to play in kind of getting there and seeing that vision?
Yeah. So one of the best ways to explain like why would competitors actually work together is to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, which is now named Cascale. And for those, for your listeners who don't know who Cascale is it's a global nonprofit alliance that actually works by empowering collaborators across the consumer goods industry to work together and combat climate change and start to address, supply chain issues and social labor issues. It's got more than 300 organizations globally. It represents almost half of the apparel and footwear industry, but it didn't start out that way. And the origin story of this organization is really interesting because you had Patagonia and Walmart, two very like diametrically opposed companies, send a letter to, about a dozen or so of their competitors in 2009 saying, "Hey, we would love to get together and have a meeting where we're talking about the state of the industry and how we might work together." And I remember one executive as a company saying that when they received that letter and it was signed by Patagonia and Walmart, they were like, we have to show up. Like this is the strangest letter that we have ever gotten." Right. So these executives, half a dozen or so executives show up to this meeting to talk about the state of the industry. And at that time, a lot of apparel and footwear companies had been doing work in their supply chain for 20 some years, working on social labor issues, et cetera. But what they realized was that they were not making the kind of progress that they had really wanted to. They were doing good work, but they were kind of these islands of good. They were all siloed companies not working together. And they were often duplicating efforts, right? So in the apparel and footwear sector, if you are a brand working with a supplier, you sometimes only have 10-15% of that facility's production, which means that facility is actually producing product for your competitors as well. And so you're duplicating efforts by sending in an auditor. One brand sends in an auditor multiple times, the same, the next brand sends their auditors, same facility, right? So you're duplicating efforts, you're duplicating cost. It's not efficient. And the other thing is that they realized that at the time they thought that there was also this threat of regulation, which of course didn't happen then, but is very much present now. And so they came together and said, okay, if we work together, if we start to align, our proprietary tools, if we start to create an industry standard, it's ultimately going to help us all, right? It'll help us to reduce costs for our individual companies. It will help us to, create greater alignment across the sector. It'll help us to, collaborate where we have shared goals and incentives and ultimately reduce this shared risk that we have. And it'll help us get in front of regulation. So as opposed to the industry being regulated, it will help us to really, not only engage regulators, but ultimately to get in front of what they thought was coming down the pipeline. So, those are all reasons why competitors want and should be collaborating, right? Like there are, you know, you're differentiating yourself on your products and your services, but a lot of times when it comes to sustainability or when it comes to supply chain, there's a huge incentive to collaborate, because it is shared risk, right? It is not an individual company, and honestly no individual company can tackle these issues alone. So you are better off by actually working with some of your competitors, and it creates, can create a lot of real innovation. So a single company with a proprietary tool, can get far, but it's not going to get as far unless it's really working with the industry to create these types of standardized tools and to leverage those tools and the insights to really move the entire industry forward. So, those are reasons why I think not only did Cascale begin, but why it continues to be effective as an organization is because it brings all of the industry, players across the value chain to the table to have these conversations and engage in how they both individually but also collectively drive progress across the industry.
I love the example of Patagonia. I wish every industry had a Patagonia, right? Like clearly such a
Yeah.
leader for the industries that haven't yet come together in this collective organization. What's the tipping point, or how can you accelerate kind of getting there? And then frankly, what keeps them there in this collective kind of collaborative state versus, okay, we transformed the industry, we're done here, everybody back to our competitive markets now.
Yeah. Well, industry transformation takes a really long time. So I will say that I don't know that any industry is there yet. But I think every industry has the opportunity to essentially create and to drive this kind of collaboration, with competitors, at a certain level. And what it really takes in terms of tipping points, I think, is, you know, sometimes it's not about quantity, it's about kind of who's in the room, right? Like who has, like Patagonia or Walmart, who has a huge amount of not only sway but the ability to actually kind of change market signals throughout an industry. And so what I think is important is as industries start to come together, it's really thinking through, where's the leverage where you can actually get the right players in the room, to start to drive that action. One of the interesting things about Pascal was that very early on, they ensured from a governance standpoint that not only was it going to be big brands and retailers, but that manufacturers were at the table as well as NGOs, academics, and civil society. So having that cross representation of stakeholders who represent every part of the value chain or the industry that you're actually trying to address is really important, right? And so I think that those are a couple of things in terms of building industry collaborations that are really important. Is one is like, where do you start, and what existing kind of associations or organizations are out there that you can actually leverage to drive change. Two, how do you make sure that you're getting the right stakeholders across the industry at the table to have those conversations? And then how are you identifying, I think, the right mix of companies to start, those leaders, et cetera, who will start to push the industry in a particular direction and will help to bring others along. And those are things that I've seen, throughout my career that have been really helpful. And, the Cascale, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, did not start off with, having 300 organizations. It started off with like a dozen, right? And it grew organically over time, because it delivered value to companies and it delivered value to the industry. It helps to, again, create standardized tools that companies could use and leverage. It helps them to essentially discern the right kind of business intelligence. It helps them to create opportunities to work together and to collaborate. And that continues to this day. And so, companies see the value of that, and, they are willing to participate. I think, Travelist is doing something similar. They're younger as an organization, But again, they're kind of building that base of organizations who recognize, I think, the importance of collaboration and are willing to lead the industry forward.
Yeah, we always talk about we live in a globalized economy, we live in a connected world. And so having some of that connectivity both amongst your competitors and your peers in your industry, as well as your own data, we're really going to tie a bow around this one, full circle, but really makes sense. Amina, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This was super insightful conversation, and it's just been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to chat.
Thank you again to our guest, Amina Razvi. And thank you for listening.
This has been the pre-read brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, sustainability, audit, and risk.
We've got more insights and hot takes coming your way, so be sure to follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your edge.
If you like the show, leave a review, send it to someone you love, or just shout it out on your next team call.
We'll be back soon. Until then, go lead it like you mean it.
I'm Steve Soder, and that's Alyssa Zucker. Our lead producer is Mike Gravano, with additional production support from Drew Hayes.
Pedro Sousa is our graphic designer. Transcripts are created and edited by Courtney Kimsey. Thanks to our digital and social team, Mike Berg, Katie Carr, and Michael Karnowski.